Ghosts, aliens, cryptids. Just say those 3 words and most people will scoff or think you're talking about some Hollywood movie, but there are some who, to them, these things are very real. I find most people, especially in my home country of the UK, are very reluctant to share any experiences they may have had with something unexplainable. However, once someone brings up their own experience, those barriers drop, and then some feel comfortable enough talking about these things. Today, I want to start that conversation. I want to tell you my own tale, but then I want to hear yours. So send me your stories either to paradoxicalshow@gmail.com or leave them in the comment section below, and I may choose your story to feature next. My story starts with the death of my grandfather. I was around the age of 9. Back in the 90s, mobile phones were massive, and not everyone had one. We certainly didn't. If something bad happened while you were away, you wouldn't find out until you got back. I remember pulling up in front of what was then our house, which we shared with my grandparents, to see most of my aunts and uncles stood outside the house. Very quickly, my sister and I were whisked away by my uncle, and we didn't know it at the time, but my granddad had just passed away. Several weeks later, I was sat in our living room in my granddad's old chair. He was kind of possessive of his chair, but in a good way. We had this game where he would walk into the room, waggle his stick at me, and I would run out of his chair laughing and joking. On the day of my first experience, I remember distinctly the house being very quiet. I was sat in my granddad's chair when out the corner of my eye, I saw my granddad walk into the room. Instinctively, I jumped out of the chair and did my usual, "Ah, you got me," before reality then hit me. That only a few weeks prior, my granddad had died. At the time, I remember being very confused, and I didn't quite know what to think or feel in that moment. I remember feeling very embarrassed. Even though I was the only one in that room, I still felt like I'd done something really silly. And I very much remember questioning myself as to why I jumped out of this chair. You didn't see anything, there's nobody there. Now, just the one sighting, fair enough. But several years later, by this point I'd already grown into a very tall and quite spotty teenager. We had moved out of my grandparents' house. There were way too many memories, and it was very difficult living in that house, especially for my parents. So we'd moved house, and one evening I was sat doing my homework on our family computer. We didn't have access to the internet at this point, and I remember it was maths homework. My least favourite homework. In typical teenage fashion, I decided that homework was stupid and that I wasn't going to do it. So I got up, I walked into our kitchen, which was situated just behind me, to go and get a drink. I closed the fridge door, and out the corner of my eye I see a man in a blue jumper walking into our living room. Now I'm going to mentally picture this for you. Our kitchen looked directly down our hallway. On the first left was a staircase leading up to the upstairs, and the second left was our living room. Now, I couldn't tell at the time whether it was someone going into the living room or going upstairs. I just remember thinking, right, that's my dad. I'm going to go ask him for some help with my homework. So I walked through the kitchen, into the dining room, out into the hallway, and into the living room, of which the living room was completely empty. I have very vivid memories of feeling ice cold at that moment, and I had goosebumps all up my arm. So as you can imagine, at this point I was quite confused. So I went upstairs, because maybe my dad went upstairs. I didn't hear him, but maybe that was him going upstairs. So I went upstairs, and on the first right was my sister's bedroom. I walked into my sister's bedroom, and there was my mum and my dad reading my sister a bedtime story. I remember asking my dad how long he had been reading the book for, to which he said to me, "It's been about 20 minutes. I was very confused, and my mind was racing at this point. I was just completely dumbfounded how I had seen somebody walk into what I assumed was our living room, and yet there was nobody there. It was at that moment that I looked at my dad, and he wasn't wearing a blue jumper. I had distinctly remembered seeing someone in a blue jumper, and my dad wasn't wearing one. I felt very sheepish at this point, and I made my excuses to leave, and I went back downstairs again. As I walked back through the dining room, I caught a glimpse of a photo frame, and my mum and dad have several photo frames up throughout their house of old pictures of family members and of me as an embarrassingly cone-headed baby. And I caught a glimpse of a photo. And in that photo was a picture of my granddad in a blue jumper. I remember thinking about the time that I saw him when I was sat in his chair. And at that point, those two experiences would go on to shape my questioning of not only the world around us, but also life after death. Okay, now comes the part of the investigation where I take off my storyteller cap and I put on my rational cap, because we're about to pick the story apart. Now, normally at this stage, it would be somebody else's story, but I'm willing to show you that even with my story, I'm not willing to leave any stone left unturned. So let's start with the rational explanations. It is very important to remember that at both times in my story, I was under some kind of emotional stress. In the first instance, I'd just lost my granddad, and my family had literally and metaphorically just been torn apart. It is important to remember that science has proved that stress can cause hallucinations. Now, these don't just have to be visual hallucinations. These could be auditory. You can even experience phantom smells. Now, these don't actually exist. They are just your brain's overloaded way of interpreting a mix of signals. So what about the second sighting? That obviously wasn't at a big time in my life. However, if you remember, I did clearly say that I was also very stressed by my maths homework. Now, not to the same degree, but you could still argue that I was still stressed at that point. It's also worth pointing out that I was a teenager, and my body's level of stress would have been high anyway. There's one more scientific explanation I wanted to point out. In my research, I came across something called peripheral visual phenomena. This is well documented, and it means that people see floaters in their eyes. Now, you may experience this yourself, where you look around and you can see a shadow in your eye. Now, these can actually be either permanent in your vision or could be temporary. They are most commonly seen out of the corner of your eye. This leads me to believe that a lot of what people would class as shadow figure sightings could potentially be peripheral visual phenomena. Now, think about it. You watch all these ghost programs, and these people put themselves into stressful situations in the dark. Their mind is racing, their heart is pumping. Hallucinations are bound to happen, especially out the corner of our eye. And while you're already thinking, this place is haunted, your brain will interpret anything it sees. That these are just simply shadows on our vision, and they could be fleeting. They could be there one minute, gone the next. But our brains like a nice, neat little story. They like to get involved in the narrative. And the most common cause of these visual disturbances is stress, of which both points in my story I was quite clearly under. It is distinctly within the realms of possibility that my teenage brain had seen the picture of my granddad on the wall in his blue jumper, and I did quite clearly state that our hallway led down to the front door. This could have possibly been a car going past my house, a blue car, that my brain, in that fleeting moment of seeing something cross my peripheral, interpreted as a figure in a blue jumper. And that when I saw the picture of my granddad in the blue jumper, my brain immediately jumped to that was my granddad. Again, going back to my original story, my granddad walking into the room, I would have been 9, 10 at this point, and everyone knows that children have extremely overactive imaginations. I cannot rule out the possibility that this was simply me interpreting something out of my peripheral as a person. That's the rational explanations out of the way. What do you think? Have you got any other rational explanations that you could come up with? Let me know in the comment section below. But let's move on to some things that I really can't explain. There's a few things I've left out of my story. First of all is that I am not the only person who has seen my granddad. When my nan was very sick, she had lung cancer and she was on palliative care in hospital. My aunt would sit with her by her bedside and keep her company. She got up to get some fresh air, and at the end of the ward was a staircase. She started walking down the staircase and she passed a man on the stairs. It was only after that she passed him that she looked up and realised that was my dad. She had just seen my granddad pass her on the stairs. But when she looked around, he was gone. Now, this experience moved my aunt so much that she went to an extreme. At least I would consider it an extreme. She sought out a psychic medium. Now, I struggle to put stock in psychic mediums. I am extremely skeptical, even downright unbelieving of them. And a lot of what the medium came out with could be easily dismissed as just generic things. But the final message that was given shocked me. The medium said to my aunt, "Tell Michael he can have my chair." I'm actually going cold saying that again. I cannot explain how someone would have that information. I didn't tell anybody that I'd had that experience. I didn't tell anybody about the chair. I didn't tell anybody about it. It was something between myself and my granddad. I can't explain it. There's one final revelation that I wanted to put in here at the end. I went to see my family over the Christmas holidays, and I brought up the conversation that I was thinking of creating this channel and that I was thinking of using my own story as an impetus to create a conversation. I was expecting maybe a chuckle, maybe a, "Oh, that's nice. Oh, you saw your granddad. That's lovely." But it turns out seeing my granddad was a common experience. It's quite clear that everybody has their own story of seeing him at some point in their life since he passed away. And I can maybe explain away my own experiences, but I don't know if I can explain away everybody's. This kind of left me with a sense of relief in a way that what I'd experienced wasn't just my own mind. But also, I think that this is an antithesis for most people's paranormal experiences. I think they're very deeply personal. I think your brain does try and convince you that either you've imagined it or that you're going crazy. The truth is, these kind of experiences are far more common than we realise. So that brings us to the end of today's episode. Thank you everybody so much for watching and listening to my story. Do you have a similar story or any spooky story that you wish to share with me? Send your stories to paradoxicalshow@gmail.com. and you may be featured in the next episode. I want to thank you again all for watching. Please make sure that you drop this video a like. And also, if you're new here, consider subscribing for every single new episode. It really does help spread this new channel out there. And it will enable me to investigate more cases, but also to broaden this. Because I think really we're all truth seekers, whether it be a scientific explanation or that the paranormal could be real. Once again, thank you everybody so much for watching. Keep an open mind, and I'll see you again soon.